As midnight approached, the once bustling John family mansion finally quieted down. The courtyard, adorned with festive decorations and filled with the joyous atmosphere of a wedding, now seemed still. Today was my wedding day, and I had finally married my childhood sweetheart, John. The union of our two prominent families was a significant event in Coldwater Town, drawing congratulations from all the notable figures in the community. However, John could not spend our wedding night with me. He had never been interested in the family business. During college, he defied his parents' wishes and chose to study biology instead of finance. He is currently a bioengineer at a research institute in the provincial capital, and his work keeps him very busy, leaving us with little time together. Right after our wedding ceremony, he rushed back to his work, while I stayed to entertain the guests with my in-laws until now. A wedding night without the groom. Perhaps no bride in the world has experienced something as peculiar as this.
Sister-in-law, you should go rest now.
Emily, my sister-in-law, linked her arm with mine.
All right.
I was grateful to have Emily, who was also my close friend, by my side today. Her presence made me feel somewhat better. Emily walked me to the door of the bridal chamber. As she was about to leave, I held her hand tightly.
Come in and have a cup of tea?
No, the bridal chamber is off limits. It would break tradition and bring bad luck.
Embarrassed, I let go of her hand.
All right, see you tomorrow.
Get some rest. My brother will be back in a few days.
I nodded, turned, and entered the bridal chamber, gently closing the door behind me. The room was a sea of red, enveloped in a thick atmosphere of celebration. But perhaps because John was absent, everything felt hollow to me. I sighed helplessly. My husband was a workaholic, deeply passionate about his research, and I should support him. After washing up and changing into my nightgown, I walked to the bed and gently lifted the red wedding quilt. To my shock, a white silk robe lay there, with an intricate pattern of the word longevity on it.
Ah!
I screamed, stumbling out of the room in a panic. The mansion, built in the traditional Huaizhou style, had a long corridor at the entrance. I ran down it in my slippers, feeling as if the corridor had no end. Emily and Mrs. Brown, the housekeeper, came running at the sound of my scream.
Sister-in-law, what's wrong?
Emily asked, looking at me in surprise.
There's a mourning robe on my bed.
A mourning robe? That's impossible.
Emily glanced at Mrs. Brown, who shook her head repeatedly.
Impossible, impossible. You must have seen wrong. How could there be a mourning robe on a wedding bed?
I didn't see wrong.
I clung to Emily's hand, her warmth unable to stop my shivering.
Let's go check it out.
Emily said, pulling me towards the bridal chamber. My heart pounded as we walked. Could this be a curse on our marriage? Back in the bridal chamber, Emily and Mrs. Brown saw the mourning robe on the bed and froze. A few seconds later, Mrs. Brown let out a scream, covering her mouth and turning away in terror.
Isn't this the burial garment from?
Mrs. Brown, what are you saying? I asked nervously.
It's nothing. Mrs. Brown, take this garment away and don't tell my parents, or they'll worry.
Mrs. Brown, trembling, walked over and picked up the garment. I grabbed her arm. Mrs. Brown, what were you about to say? Please, tell me clearly.
Mrs. Brown, don't say anything rash.
Emily walked over and gently pushed Mrs. Brown.
I
was getting angry and frowned at Emily. This has already happened. No matter what the truth is, I need to know. How else can I live my life? Emily bit her lip, turned away, and folded her arms. After a long while, she said in a low voice,
That burial garment is the one Sophia was buried in.
I shuddered, my scalp tingling.
No, you can't say that.
Emily hugged my shoulders.
It's just that it looks like the one she was buried in. I think someone is playing a prank. Don't be scared, I'll find out who did this.
I nodded weakly. They comforted me for a few moments before leaving. I stood in front of the bridal bed, a mix of sadness and fear swirling inside me. Sophia was my husband John's first love. They had been together since John was 15, and Sophia was 2 years older. They were together for 10 years. When John told his family he wanted to marry Sophia, the whole family opposed it. The prestigious John family couldn't possibly accept a girl from a single-parent household. The John family was the most prominent family in Coldwater Town, while Sophia had come here with her mother to make a living. Her mother worked in a tailor shop, and after high school, Sophia worked in a relative's photo studio. After the family's opposition, Sophia fell ill from the stress and passed away within a year. John was in a daze for a year, and it was during that dark time that I had the chance to get close to him and take care of him. Love is a matter of timing and circumstance. Our families were old friends. I was 3 years younger than him and had admired this handsome and outstanding brother since childhood. Our families thought we were a perfect match, but John was always with Sophia, refusing to break up despite his parents' pressure. I, the longtime backup, finally got close to him after Sophia's death. His mother arranged a dinner, drugged our drinks, and I naturally became pregnant. After that, I became the daughter-in-law of the John family. I was surprised that John wasn't angry about such an absurd plan. I apologized to him with guilt, but he just smiled.
I know how you feel about me. Marrying you is the right thing to do. I've moved on from the past.
I thought he was willing to accept this arrangement and had moved on from Sophia. But after what happened just now, I realized our marriage might have been cursed from the start. Perhaps the deceased Sophia had always been by his side, never willing to let him marry. I closed my eyes in sorrow, clasped my hands over my heart, and prayed silently. Narrator, tone, sad. The room was a sea of red, enveloped in a thick atmosphere of celebration. But perhaps because John was absent, everything felt hollow to me.
Tone. Sad John. Why do you have to be so dedicated to your research?
I sighed helplessly, knowing my husband was a workaholic, deeply passionate about his research. I should support him. After washing up and changing into my nightgown, I walked to the bed and gently lifted the red wedding quilt, only to find a white silk robe lying there, with an intricate pattern of the word longevity on it.
Tone. Terrified awe.
I screamed, stumbling out of the room in a panic. The mansion, built in the traditional Huaizhou style, had a long corridor at the entrance. I ran down it in my slippers, feeling as if the corridor had no end. Emily and Mrs. Brown, the housekeeper, came running at the sound of my scream.
Emily, tone, surprised sister-in-law, what's wrong?
Tone. Terrified there's a funeral robe on my bed.
Emily, tone, shocked. A funeral robe? That's impossible.
Emily glanced at Mrs. Brown, who shook her head repeatedly.
Mrs. Brown, tone, serious. Impossible, impossible. You must have seen wrong. How could there be a funeral robe on a wedding bed?
Tone. Trembling, I didn't see wrong.
I clung to Emily's hand, her warmth unable to stop my shivering.
Emily, tone, serious. Let's go check it out.
Emily pulled me towards the bridal chamber. My heart pounded as we walked. Could this be a curse on our marriage? Back in the bridal chamber, Emily and Mrs. Brown saw the funeral robe on the bed and froze. A few seconds later, Mrs. Brown let out a scream, covering her mouth and turning away in terror. The gray scarf is still on the windowsill, the one Sophia knitted for your brother. I held her hand tightly.
All right, don't overthink it. I guess someone played a prank and deliberately put the scarf on the windowsill. Don't be afraid.
Emily comforted me for a long time, but I was still very scared. I even shamelessly suggested staying with her for the night. But she didn't agree because, according to our customs, the newlywed bed must be slept in for 3 months, or one of the newlyweds would have a short life. I had to follow such customs and taboos. Emily stayed with me for an hour and then sent me back to the room. Strangely, when we returned, the gray scarf I had thrown on the floor was gone. I sat in the room, too scared to sleep, keeping the light on until dawn. The strange incense smell on that gray scarf lingered in my nostrils. In the afternoon, I texted John, telling him about these 2 eerie incidents. I hadn't planned to mention the burial garment on the wedding bed before, fearing it would ruin his wedding mood. But after what happened last night, I couldn't take it anymore and decided to tell him everything. A few hours later, John actually called me back. Hearing his voice, tears instantly welled up in my eyes.
Don't overthink it. There are no such things as ghosts in this world.
Yes, I know there are no ghosts, but these consecutive incidents make it hard for me to believe in materialism. I'm really scared. John was silent for a long time, then his tone suddenly turned cold.
If you insist on thinking that way, I'll have them check the surveillance to prove who is playing pranks. Also, I don't want you to mention the past again.
With that, John hung up. I knew he was angry. Ever since Sophia passed away, he wouldn't mention her in front of anyone. I didn't understand if he wanted to bury that love silently or if mentioning Sophia still caused him pain. Thinking about it, I felt a bit sad and jealous. How long does it take to forget someone? Before dinner, Mother called me to the living room. As soon as I walked in, I saw Mrs. Smith standing beside Mother with a frightened look on her face. I instantly became nervous. Mom, what happened?
Mother sighed, glanced at Mrs. Smith, and said expressionlessly, "A few days ago, John suddenly called and asked us to check the surveillance, saying someone was trying to scare you. Mrs. Smith, you explain yourself."
I'm sorry, ma'am. Mrs. Smith looked apologetic. I was out of my mind and did those things to scare you. Please forgive me.
I looked at Mrs. Smith in surprise. What did you say?
Mrs. Smith's hands were nervously intertwined. It's like this. On the wedding day, you gave each of us maids a red envelope. I felt the red envelope was too small. I serve you all the time, and I felt unbalanced, so I wanted to take revenge on you. So I put that burial garment on your and the young master's wedding bed. The other night, I pretended to be a ghost outside your window and deliberately left that scarf. I'm sorry.
Mrs. Smith clasped her hands together, repeatedly apologizing. My mind went blank. Mother scolded Mrs. Smith in front of me, saying that if such things happened again, she would be sent packing. After Mrs. Smith left, Mother stared at me with a very stern look. I secretly pinched my palm.
Daughter-in-law, our John family is a prestigious family, and we cannot afford any rumors. I don't want to hear anyone saying this house is unclean or haunted.
Mother's words were not harsh, but they felt like a loud slap on my face. I lowered my head in shame.
I'm sorry, Mother. I was just scared and imagining things. I won't do it again.
Mother stood up and sighed meaningfully.
Life is what you make of it. If you start doubting yourself, others will surely laugh at you.
After saying this, Mother left. I stood there, my mind in chaos. Why didn't I fully believe Mrs. Smith's explanation? Hopefully, it's just my overthinking. Perhaps because of this incident, John suddenly became distant from me. Sometimes when I sent him messages, he would reply a day later, and his responses were short and impatient. I felt increasingly wronged. After all, those things were beyond my control. Don't I have the right to express my grievances and fears to him? In the blink of an eye, I was already 5 months pregnant. Thinking that in a few months, the baby would be born, and having the baby with me might bring warmth to my days, I barely felt hopeful. That day, relatives came to visit, and John's aunt brought her whole family over. The house was immediately filled with the joyful laughter of children, making the usually solemn mansion lively. After dinner, everyone sat in the living room chatting while a few children played outside. Everyone was happily chatting when suddenly, a child's piercing cry came from outside. The laughter abruptly stopped. John's cousin's eldest daughter walked in nervously, holding her crying younger sister. John's cousin quickly walked over and picked up her younger daughter, frowning.
Lily, how are you being a big sister, always making your sister cry?
This time I really didn't bully her. She got scared by herself.
Scared by whom?
Lily lowered her head, and after a long while, she stammered.
Just now, my sister ran into Uncle's study to play. She saw a strange lady in white inside. The strange lady looked very scary, and she got scared and cried.
What did you say?
My heart instantly tightened. Emily subconsciously glanced at me.
Lily, what did the strange lady look like?
My sister said the strange lady's eyes were very strange, like a fox's eyes.
My heart trembled, and looking at the still crying younger daughter, a chill ran down my spine. A child wouldn't describe eyes that look like a fox's eyes. Those are called phoenix eyes. Sophia had a pair of phoenix eyes. John once said that when she smiled, it felt like a spring breeze blowing into his world. Lily's sister was only 4 years old. The elders say that children under 5 can see those things. A huge fear surged in my heart, and I secretly clutched my clothes. Sophia was back again. The atmosphere grew heavy, and everyone fell silent, their faces turning somber. John's cousin quickly took her 2 children out of the living room. A relative tried to lighten the mood with a smile, bringing up a new topic, breaking the silence. Everyone continued chatting as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't focus. Several times, relatives spoke to me, and I was lost in thought.
Come here and sit.
I felt extremely nervous, certain that Mother would scold me harshly. Trembling, I walked into her bedroom, only to see her smiling at me.
Yes, Mother. I will take good care of myself and protect the baby. Do you know why I was always against my son marrying Sophia?
I knew the answer but didn't dare to speak.
Not only because of her humble background, but I also had her fortune told. She was destined for a short life, not living past 30. How could I let my son marry such a woman?
I stared in shock, my back cold.
I only recognize you as my daughter-in-law. Anyone who dares to ruin your marriage with John will face my wrath. Nothing will stop me.
With Mother supporting me, what did I have to fear?
You mustn't let your mind wander. The baby is over 5 months now. Take good care of yourself so the child can grow up healthy. This is the first grandchild of our family, and we value him greatly.
A marriage without the support of elders cannot be happy. Even if Sophia and John had defied everyone to be together, they wouldn't have been happy in the end. My union with John was the right one. But I had oversimplified everything. Despite the family's support, Sophia would never forgive me. I began having nightmares, where Sophia angrily chased me, demanding I return John to her, or she would harm me. After half a month of this, I couldn't sleep or eat well and became extremely weak, often feeling dazed even during the day. I had no choice but to seek Emily's help, asking her to accompany me to a temple to pray for protection for me and the baby.
If praying to the gods doesn't work, then we should burn some paper offerings for Sophia. It's because she won't forgive you that you keep dreaming of her.
It made sense. The gods could protect me from evil spirits, but Sophia held a grudge against me. Until that grudge was resolved, I would continue having nightmares.
Burning paper offerings during the day wouldn't work. Only at night could the spirits receive them, as they wouldn't come out during the day due to the strong yang energy.
After 7 p.m., as night fell, Emily drove me away from the mansion. We lied, saying we were visiting a friend. Sophia was buried in a suburban cemetery, in a plot chosen by John, near the roadside, because Sophia liked being close to the street. The room was a sea of red, enveloped in a thick atmosphere of celebration. But perhaps because John was absent, everything felt hollow to me. I sighed helplessly. My husband was a workaholic, deeply passionate about his research, and I knew I should support him. After washing up and changing into my nightgown, I walked to the bed and gently lifted the red wedding quilt. To my shock, a white silk robe lay there, with an intricate pattern of the word longevity on it. Ah! I screamed, stumbling out of the room in a panic. The mansion, built in the traditional Huizhou style, had a long corridor at the entrance. I ran down it in my slippers, feeling as if the corridor had no end. Emily and Mrs. Brown, the housekeeper, came running at the sound of my scream.
Sister-in-law, what's wrong?
There's a funeral robe on my bed.
A funeral robe? That's impossible.
I didn't see wrong.
Let's go check it out.
My heart pounded as we walked. Could this be a curse on our marriage? Back in the bridal chamber, Emily and Mrs. Brown saw the funeral robe on the bed and froze. A few seconds later, Mrs. Brown let out a scream, covering her mouth and turning away in terror. My mother also advised me to go back and stay for a while, but I refused. I was afraid my mother-in-law would misunderstand. Because of this incident, my mother-in-law fell ill. Perhaps because I had just narrowly escaped a serious mishap, she didn't blame me, but she refused to see me. On the 4th day after I returned, John finally came back. Seeing him, I burst into tears before I could say a word. John sat on the bed, holding my hand, frowning slightly as he looked at me.
Don't cry. It's good that you and the baby are okay.
I'm sorry, John. I almost lost our baby. It's all my fault for overthinking. But I really can't control it. Why do I keep dreaming about her? Is it because she won't forgive me? Does she think I took you away from her? I grabbed John's arm, shouting somewhat hysterically. John shook his head and took a tissue to wipe my tears.
She's gone. I'm a biology student. I understand better than anyone that once a life is gone, it can't come back. It was at the moment she passed that my heart died too.
I pressed my lips tightly together, tears streaming down uncontrollably. John wasn't the type of man to say sweet, romantic words, but what he just said was the best proof of his love for me. His feelings for Sophia were completely gone. Now, his heart belonged only to me. John stayed with me for 2 days before he left again. I walked him to the door. He wouldn't let me go any further. He turned and looked at me, his smile as bright as sunshine, dispelling all the darkness in my heart.
Go back inside. It's getting cold. Be careful not to catch a cold.
I stood there, dazed, feeling a sweetness in my heart, just like when we first met. For this man and our child, No matter how terrifying the danger, I had to hold on. But things weren't going well. I still dreamed of Sophia, and the situation was getting worse. Now she not only tried to harm me but also threatened to harm my child. I only dared to tell Emily about these things, but eventually, even she didn't understand me. She thought it was all in my imagination.
There was no ghost of Sophia, it was your inner demons at work. You always saw Sophia as an invisible rival, thinking about her during the day and dreaming about her at night, so she became deeply rooted in your heart.
Under Emily's persuasion, I agreed to see a psychologist. But I begged Emily not to tell John. I didn't want John to think I had psychological issues. To avoid alarming others, Emily personally drove me to a reputable hospital in the city, where we had an appointment with a renowned psychology expert. The consultation went smoothly. After talking with the expert, I felt much more at ease. Since I was pregnant, the doctor didn't prescribe any sleep aids but gave me some suggestions, like listening to relaxing music, reading interesting books, watching movies, and going out more often. Sitting in the car, I took a deep breath and leaned back in the seat. Emily, thank you for taking me to see the psychologist. I feel much better now.
Of course. You just needed to talk to a psychologist to clear your mind. Stop thinking about those nonsensical things.
At that moment, my hand suddenly touched something soft. I picked it up suspiciously and screamed, throwing it away.
What's wrong?
There's a doll. I pointed shakily at the doll I had thrown to the floor. Emily picked it up, frowning, and was also startled. It was a palm-sized doll, dressed in a pink dress, finely crafted but missing a head.
Some kid's prank. How disgusting. Ignore it.
Emily opened the car window and threw the doll far away, then stepped on the gas pedal. The room was a sea of red, enveloped in a thick atmosphere of celebration. But perhaps because John was absent, everything felt hollow to me. I sighed helplessly.
Cheerful, sister-in-law, why the long face? It's your big day.
My husband was a workaholic, deeply passionate about his research, and I should support him.
Friendly, John will be here soon, don't worry.
After washing up and changing into my nightgown, I walked to the bed and gently lifted the red wedding quilt. To my shock, a white silk robe lay there, with an intricate pattern of the word longevity on it. Ah! I screamed, stumbling out of the room in a panic. The mansion, built in the traditional Huaizhou style, had a long corridor at the entrance. I ran down it in my slippers, feeling as if the corridor had no end. Emily and Mrs. Brown, the housekeeper, came running at the sound of my scream.
Concerned, sister-in-law, what's wrong?
There's a funeral robe on my bed.
Shocked, a funeral robe? That's impossible.
Emily glanced at Mrs. Brown, who shook her head repeatedly.
Serious? Impossible, impossible. You must have seen wrong. How could there be a funeral robe on a wedding bed?
I didn't see wrong. I clung to Emily's hand, her warmth unable to stop my shivering.
Serious, let's go check it out. Emily said, pulling me towards the bridal chamber.
My heart pounded as we walked. Could this be a curse on our marriage? Back in the bridal chamber, Emily and Mrs. Brown saw the funeral robe on the bed and froze. A few seconds later, Mrs. Brown let out a scream, covering her mouth and turning away in terror. The room was a sea of red, enveloped in a thick atmosphere of celebration. But with John absent, everything felt hollow to me. I sighed helplessly. My husband was a workaholic, deeply passionate about his research, and I should support him. After washing up and changing into my nightgown, I walked to the bed and gently lifted the red wedding quilt. To my shock, a white silk robe lay there, with an intricate pattern of the word longevity on it.
Ah! Relieved, I screamed, stumbling out of the room in a panic. The mansion, built in the traditional Huaizhou style, had a long corridor at the entrance. I ran down it in my slippers, feeling as if the corridor had no end.
Sister-in-law, what's wrong?
There's a funeral robe on my bed.
A funeral robe? That's impossible.
Emily glanced at Mrs. Brown, who shook her head repeatedly.
Impossible, impossible. You must have seen wrong. How could there be a funeral robe on a wedding bed?
I didn't see wrong. Clinging to Emily's hand.
Let's go check it out.
My heart pounded as we walked. Could this be a curse on our marriage? Back in the bridal chamber, Emily and Mrs. Brown saw the funeral robe on the bed and froze.
Oh my goodness! Covering her mouth and turning away.